G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far you are also having a fantastic weekend. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. Of course, we'll be looking at the maps and I've got some geolocations of flags going up to show you again. Of course, we'll also be comparing maps. We also need to look at some planes going down, some strikes, some vehicles as well. And the main part of this video, of course, is going to be about the meetings that occurred in Turkey. Now, I don't want to call this negotiation because I don't think that that meets my threshold for actually negotiating, but we'll talk about the politics in action here, the theatre in action, and some comments that have been made coming out of this, and also an overall look at where may this go. But there has been one big positive come out of this, that there will be a 1,000 for 1,000 prisoner of war swap. So 2,000 families, 2,000 sets of parents will be getting their loved ones home. And that is fantastic. So that will be the main part of this video, but we do have some other bits and pieces to look over. Now, in our folder of strikes, planes and vehicles, we can see that the Ukrainian Air Force has confirmed the loss of another F-16 while repelling an air attack. And it said that it was using its main cannon, the gun on the front of the aircraft, to engage these drones, and then the pilot then ejected. He was then evacuated and his health and life are not in danger. And one thing we will say is fighting drones or missiles in the sky is incredibly dangerous, not only due to the fragmentation if you hit something with your main gun and it sucks up through your engines, but also due to friendly air defense is also going to be operating. And there are some Russian pages saying that they are trapping some Ukrainian aircraft with drones. By sending up these drones, they likely will have Ukrainian aircraft in the sky, and then they deploy their own fighters with air-to-air missiles to try and engage these aircraft. And this is the third confirmed loss of an F-16, with, of those three, 2 of the pilots killed. Now, losses in war are normal, and this is to be expected. I know people absolutely said that F-16 was going to be flying over Moscow and made merch and that it was the next wonder weapon of a whole line of wonder weapons. But this is attritional war, and planes, machines, and people sadly get lost in war. But this is a significant number when we account for the very small amount that Ukraine has received of these aircraft. And of Air Force losses, recently Ukraine has taken more than Russia has, but of course has nowhere near the arsenal, the numerical value of fighter aircraft. That the amount of F-16 sits somewhere between 6 and 20, around that, of course, is not disclosed, but 3 is a large amount of those. So again, this is an incredibly complex machine. Now, many pages, massive pages, and no one takes accountability when they are incorrect, have been stating that this Kar-52 was taken out by a Ukrainian FPV drone. We can see this Kar-52 here, and then the drone cut out the footage here. Now, just from watching this footage, I first thought that looks like it's on trajectory to either miss or maybe take out the rear. And on a helicopter like a Kar-52 with these counter-rotating then rotors, the rear of this aircraft is significantly less important, I say less important, than on a typical helicopter with a vertical rotor as well. We've seen some of these taken out the complete rear of them and be able to make it back. But also, a drone is very light, and if you've ever stood under a large helicopter's rotor wash, it looked like it would wash out unless it was air burst. And then Fighter Bomber has said this: the video's good, but ours are all home. We'll take into account, of course, military pilots. So saying that no chopper was hit, but we need to take this into account, and absolutely. We've said that ever since we saw that video, it's got to be 2 years ago, of the Su-25 almost impacting with an FPV drone. And if you think that a bird strike is bloody tragic, imagine hitting then a drone in the sky. And this is a major factor for aircraft conducting close air support within range of the massive saturation of drones. Now, what we do see as well is there's no ideas that are stupid, because again and again, we keep seeing it be adopted. So we see the cope cage made fun of. Everything has it now, from Macavers through to Leopards through to T90s. Motorcycles, scooters on the front line. Everyone who's never served in light infantry said it was stupid. And we see that being adopted. I've got some screenshots of people saying this is the worst strategy I've ever seen. Strap into that. And of course, the Bliat barns, as we would like to refer to them, or then the house tanks, the tanks with just everything on it due to the threat of drones and shrapnel, just extra armour on them, as well as there would be a degree too. If you have AI targeting drones that knows what a tank looks like, well, right here, you're not going to pick that up. And this is reportedly, allegedly, a Ukrainian tank with then the Bliat barn on top. And it was just a matter of time. Now, yesterday, when negotiations were taking place, there was major air attacks both ways. Of course, Russia with drones and Ukraine with drones into Crimea. And we do see in this footage here, down in Crimea, of an ammo depot being hit by a drone and exploding. We know it was an ammo depot because there was a large amount of secondary explosions following on from this that we could hear. And no surprise, that will continue both ways, absolutely. But at the end of the day, what wins wars is armies. A war has never been won and will never be won purely just off strategic strikes. All that is force multiplication, makes it more difficult for forces in the front line, but it's not won by that. Ground wars are won by the army. Wars in general are won by then the land forces, infantry, armour, arty. Everything else from naval assets to planes to drones, whatever, is to support that line pushing or attriting. Now, a lot of people, I think, get this wrong, and mainly through the Russian pages that I see. We saw a large exchange of bodies take place of fallen soldiers, and this is being skewed around. And the return was, as far as I'm saying, 34 then Russian soldiers returned and 909 Ukrainian soldiers returned. Their bodies returned because sadly they have died in this war. What I believe still could have been avoided with real diplomacy and actions taken then 10 years ago. But regardless, I'm seeing the claim that the ratio is 27 Ukrainians for 1 Russian. And this is another case here of how you interpret data is more important in many ways than the data itself. We see this with linear trajectories of frontline movings and all of this. This does not represent a 27-to-1 kill ratio on the front line. This figure is skewed because Russia is advancing on the line. Now, this may be a shock to many if you're just watching all the large YouTubers, but Russia has been advancing for the past 18 months. And they're dead. They are more likely to end up falling in territory that they control or that they are taking control of. Also, another factor here is the way that Russia is enveloping and vertically cutting off Ukrainian forces will make it more difficult for Ukraine to extract their killed in action and at some point wounded in action as well. So that will, of course, skew this figure. But there is still some things to take from this figure, even if we accept that it is skewed. But it does represent very large losses, and it can be used to rebut the idea that losses are 10-to-1 or 15-to-1 in Ukraine's favour, where we know in reality, given the overmatch of things like artillery, the parity at least of FPV, and some other bits and pieces here, it's probably nowhere near that figure. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the maps and then we will talk about Turkey. So, of course, here we have Ukraine in the centre of the screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupy since 22, the purple since 2014, the red check area that Russia has moved. Now, the first area I want to come down into is then around Pokrovsk. Now, we don't see any movement here today. We have Malanivkia, Moroluabivkia, and this is all of this like Pokrovsk eastern sector. But let's have a look on this Syriac maps because he is very reliable. Regardless of what you think of him, very reliable, especially when it comes to this war. A fair bit more bias on things in the Middle East. But what we see is to the east of Kalinove, that he is suggesting that this area just in here is filling in as it has been then enveloped, and as well from the east of Tarasivkia, Baranivkia in then where my cursor is currently, and more northerly push above Alexandropil as well, just overall taking more ground in here. And again, as many pages are suggesting from both sides of the coin, that from this Novosilka and Toretsk is then the large envelopment here. And we know this because I'm seeing more often people saying this is not strategically important. What means that it is, and means that the situation is probably not great here. But let's look at a bit of geolocated footage. Now, in this area around Balanivkia, Marolubivkia, what we do see then this grey zone has shifted. So we go from yesterday to today, we do see a shift there, but we thought everything was repelled here. It's what we are getting told again and again when we see footage. Well, we see 3 geolocations. This one yesterday that I showed you, this one today, and also this one today of Russian flags going up. Now, what I'm about to say is going to be a little bit unclear, because in the footage we have shared by Russian media, we have 2 flags going up, being these 2, but I actually don't know which is which, but the geolocator is incredibly reliable. So these going up there. So let's have a look at this, and this is further on in this footage here, confirming at least presence further onto these areas. So we have then this building here, we can see where Russian forces are then operating, standing around, and we will see some flags go up in a second. This guy has the wish.com size flag, and then we see further on in the footage, then this guy here with your typical sized flag as well. And I had tried to have a look, but the amount of destruction here is difficult to get an idea, but we can see on both sides of Miralur-Bivkia. So by seeing that, I think it's highly likely that that red zone is significantly more close to that area, as well as a large reduction in Ukrainian presence there as well. That is dangerous because it is the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, and relatively to the rest of the war, has moved fairly quickly. Now let's go to Pokrovsk, and we then turn this back on today, and we see just out of Uspenivkia in this sector, we can see in Novu Alexandrivkia that Russia has made some ground today, confirming a Syriac update from a little bit ago. Now we come down Bahatar Rozli front line. This is where there's been a bit of correction on this map. Not only does it show the filling in between Bahatar and Rozliv, which I'm not surprised by at all. Attritional warfare like this, massively costly on your expendable equipment. You just don't get the island boys of Rozliv, the island boys of Bahatar, the island boys of Vovchansk. That was the funniest one for like 6 weeks. It just doesn't really work like that. But we can see a bit of a correction here. So in Bahatar itself, a reduction in control, but then overall an increase here too. And this is really becoming what Syriac calls the Velik Novosilka front line. And he does suggest this fill in here, but way past this, or not way past, but past where this is, up to this road, but as well, a Russian movement to the southern edge of Odradne as well. So right where my cursor is here, the Russians are pushing on that sector. As well as if we come down, Vilny Pole, I showed you a geolocation here yesterday, and we can see Syriac, he's saying that that area has come under control of the Russian forces. So it does continue to march on. Yes, slowly, but again, as we have said, this is attritional warfare. Slowly fall off a cliff. Economics can work the same, and this is what people will say. This is what annoys me more than anything, is people will apply logic and reasoning one way, and they won't apply logic and reasoning the other way. There are some huge culprits of this. So what people will say about sanctions, economic sanctions, is they will say along the lines of what I say is, no, economic sanctions are little by little, then all at once. And what I say is, well, attritional warfare is very, very similar to that. And they won't apply their own logic and reasoning because it doesn't fit their narrative. What I say is we've got 2 things attriting. We have Russia's economy and Ukraine's front line attriting. Which one is closer? Well, the crystal ball is going to tell us, because I have no hope that this war is not going to be fought to the conclusion just due to the negotiating that we see, but apply it both ways. Now, around Toretsk, where we see this tree line just in here. We said the other day, Syriac showed Russian movement in here, that this area here, according to Syriac, has come back under control of the Ukrainian forces. Then we move just to the north of here, an area you'll be familiar with, Chasiv Yar Bakhmut. A lot of pages talking about this recently, and Syriac says it's not possible to speak about Russian capture here, but there has been advancement in some of these centre blocks, which DeepStat Map did show about 2 to 3 days ago. So let's talk about Turkey. And we're going to go fairly in-depth here with the Willy slideshow. And one of the biggest things I think is forgotten in diplomacy or assessment is the idea that understanding an adversary requires seeing the world through their eyes without surrendering your own vision. And having a different opinion of something doesn't mean then you are justifying that, although people will make that synonymous to try and have a more of a personal attack. We'll go over that more in a second. So, Turkey. That we see this shared from the media, that it was really under 2 hours. It was about 90 minutes the talks end. But there was that major prisoner of war exchange, which is fantastic. And I see many people very disappointed in the lack of results. But what I will say, in my opinion, the talks themselves, the first ones in over 3 years since Turkey, this is a massive step. Well, I'm somewhat in two minds of this. It's either a step in the right direction or it's going to be the end of talks because these diplomats might walk away and go, there's nothing, there's no ground to be made there. So it may be the last one we see for another year before we go back to significantly worse conditions again. Or it is, I hope, my optimistic brain says, I hope it is a step in the right direction. And that Ukrainian source, they have described what Russia was presenting as non-starters. And we don't know exactly what happened here, so it's sort of going off scraps at the moment. But the Russian delegation, they have stated that Ukraine must withdraw forces from the 4 oblasts. Then they will talk about a ceasefire. And Ukraine has said that these demands, that these are unrealistic and go far beyond what was demanded during Istanbul talks of 2022. Now, what I will say is everyone points towards just territory of the difference then to now, but the war is in a very different way from then to now as well, with unsuccessful offensives being launched and a very different overview as well. You're never going to go back to that. It may be better, it may be worse, but it was never going to be then the same. Now, the talks in an Istanbul palace lasted well under 2 hours. Russia expressed satisfaction with the meeting and said that it was ready to continue contacts. Both countries said they had agreed to trade within 1,000 prisoners each, which, as I said in the beginning, is fantastic. But Kyiv, which wants the West to impose tighter sanctions, unless Moscow accepts a proposal from Trump for a 30-day ceasefire, immediately begun rallying its allies for tougher action. And what we know is basically during this and after that, Zelensky had a phone call with Western leaders, including Trump, trying to rally more tough sanctions as well. And in my opinion, that is all that 30-day ceasefire was ever there to do. No one, well, I struggle to think anyone really believed that was ever going to be accepted, but it gave an easy win for the ability to bring the US on side with sanctions, because sanctions without the US has nowhere near the impact. Now, this is a foreign correspondent for The Economist. Have an inside view into the Russian-Ukrainian talks from a well-placed source. This from the Russian delegation, head Medinsky, says it all. Quote, "We don't want war, but we're ready to fight for another year, 2, 3, however long it takes. We fought Sweden for 21 years. How long are you ready to fight?" And we do on this channel say that time does benefit Russia. Time will make it significantly more costly for Russia as well. But we have come to that conclusion through the way of attritional war, and that a small Soviet army won't win against a large Soviet army, just even down to population and replenishment forces, all of that as well. And we wouldn't have then Karen Kallis and others like that saying that Russia's trying to drag this war out if it wasn't in favour of Russia. If time was in favour of Ukraine, they would have no problem with that occurring. And actively, Russia trying to drag this war out. And then we get from the editor-in-chief of Russia Today. The story's been making rounds that Ukrainians were outraged when Russian negotiators said that Ukrainian soldiers must leave the 4 new Russian regions as part of a ceasefire. Remember, Russia don't occupy all of those. To which the Moscow delegation replied, next time it will be 5. either referring to Sumy or Dnipro Oblast. Our reporter in Istanbul got to ask the Russian side how it really went down, and apparently said, we didn't say 5, we said 8. So I'm not sure what the other ones would be here, but significantly more. Again, a lot of hardball being played. Now, these are some takeaways of things that Trump has said, and I'm very glad to have found a photo with Trump and a turkey. But Trump has said, honestly, I will, referring to in sanctions, if we're not going to make a deal. This is Turkey time. We're talking Turkey, and we'll see what happens. This would be crushing for Russia because they're having a hard time now with the economy. Oil prices are low. The sanctions the US is really looking at here are secondary sanctions. With the current friction between the US and China and India around tariffs, I just don't know how secondary sanctions would go. My source yesterday was correct when he basically said that secondary sanctions are hugely hypocritical towards sovereign and independence that these states see so highly. Because you're saying your state, who is sovereign and independent, but we are putting sanctions on you for dealing with another state. It's going to be very, very tough for Trump, and I just don't know how that's going to look at this point in time. He also said, I have a very good relationship with Putin. I think we'll make a deal. We have to get together, and I think we'll probably schedule it. And Trump did really harpoon these talks, saying that nothing will happen until he has met with Putin. He also said, look, I had a real rough session with Zelensky because I didn't like what he said, and he was not making it easy. And I honestly said he doesn't have the cards. And he doesn't have the cards. You know, I'm being honest. He doesn't have the cards. So we get a better idea of how Trump is looking at this. And we're trying to somehow paint a picture of how does Trump really see where this war is going and how it looks. Now, Keir Starmer from the UK has said if Russia is unwilling to come to the negotiating table, Putin must pay the price. Speaking to POTUS, we are closely aligning our response to Russia's unacceptable position. But I will say, well, Russia did come to this as a negotiating position, but your two positions are so far apart. And I've said a lot of leaders need a dictionary more than Twitter. Negotiation is a process where two or more parties engage in a dialogue to reach a mutually acceptable agreement. Resolving differences or achieving shared goals, it involves a give and take approach, with each party potentially making concessions to reach a solution, but also taking into account then realities of the world and strengths and weaknesses as well. So, Keir, should I ask the forbidden question? That forbidden question is, what if Putin just says no? Or will Europe continue dragging their feet on real support due to the interest in power balancing Russia and using a bloodletting strategy? And in the Marine Corps University, Professor Mearsheimer says about bloodletting that the aim is to make sure that any war between one rival turns into a long and costly conflict that zaps their strength. The bloodletter is mainly concerned with causing its rivals to bleed each other while it stays out of the conflict. And the longer and longer this goes on, with the foot dragging and the unwillingness for more support or more real aid or even then further actions, it looks more and more like that Europe is going, well, we can bloodlet Russia and reduce and balance the power here by not having any of our own forces having to do this. And the foot dragging and buying more Russian energy than aid to Ukraine, well, it more and more is meeting that calculus. So this is where we go into what is sort of the differences being used here. It's reported that Russia and Ukraine have made plans to hold another meeting, although dates have not been made public. The 30-day ceasefire, which is what the Ukrainian delegation went into this with, this is nothing but political theatre to give Ukraine diplomatic points. They know that Russia won't accept it. So the US, they will then support further sanctions against Russia. Or if Russia was to accept it, it would give Ukraine a breather while taking Russia's momentum. So it was a win-win either way. You're going to get your momentum or you're going to get diplomatic points, and America will back sanctions. But there was never, in my opinion, any expectation that Russia would sign that off, because that only impacted Russia. It was the side who is the losing party on the battlefield currently, who does not have the momentum or the initiative, then trying to dictate the terms to then regain that. That is not how it would go. It would be seen just as ridiculous at the end of 2022 if Russia said, hey, we want a 30-day ceasefire at this point in time. Or if the table shifted and Ukraine had the initiative and had the momentum on the battlefield, it would be just as ridiculous. It's not how that would work. But meanwhile, in this, Russia continues with their maximalist demands for areas of which they do not control. And the cost to take them, if it is even possible, will be huge. Now, Vladimir Medinsky, he's the one that led up the Russian delegation here. He explained Russia's position on ceasefire demands, arguing that the 30-day ceasefire currently proposed by Ukraine, the EU and the US was impossible. And he also says, this has never happened in past military conflicts. The people who are demanding it don't know history. He stated, as Napoleon said, war and negotiations are conducted simultaneously. Now, many have pointed out that this is not a direct quote from Napoleon, and this is correct, although it does align with Napoleon's strategic approach, and it aligns with his known conduct of negotiating while still on campaign, using both military pressure and diplomacy to achieve his aims. And this is very similar to Karl von Clausewitz as well, who we talk about a lot on this channel, that war is merely the continuation of policy by other means, or the political object is the goal. War is the means of reaching it, and means can never be considered in isolation from their purpose. And this is why I'm not separating the military maps and strikes away from the politics in my videos, because these are not in isolation. These are not mutually exclusive. It is all part of one, even if many states' leaders would like the ability to separate this to fit their narrative or their ideals. And a lot of the time when we're speaking about Napoleon, Clausewitz or others, we are more going with strategic approaches and known conduct rather than direct quotes. So we need to go over this, and this comes with a little bit of a disclaimer and some things I wanted to talk about. So this sort of politics, this does make more sense to me because I may have a bit of a skewed vision from being in the military myself for the majority of my adult life, and military force for political outcome is really the main element of that. And I'm far better read on guys like Kissinger, Mearsheimer, Bismarck than, say, Wilsonianism. And there's also this idea that this way of thinking that, in my opinion, aligns with history and the realities of the world is a justification for war. And it is no justification for war, but politicians, journalists, and basement warriors on Twitter and Telegram and whatever, they will try to make explanation and justification synonymous. And this is a cheap way to strawman your argument and discredit not your point, but to discredit you as a person. And this is no different to in political discussions. We see a lot of the left just refer to you as MAGA, as sexist, as racist, to not discredit your point, but discredit the person. And we've seen a lot recently, a lot of conservatives using the term woke as a way to do this and lump you in with everything, rather than if you're trying to explain something rather than justify it. But I myself more align with the Realpolitik way of thinking, and I believe that is why, rather than more of this idealistic way of thinking. And this way of thinking does align more with how we see Russia conducting politics. And this is a bit of an old school way of diplomacy, the idea of military means to achieve political outcomes. But this is seen as a foreign concept, and this in no way should be a foreign concept to European states. These states have the longest history of using force to influence politics. Germany, Russia, UK, no one, this shouldn't be foreign to this, but it does seem that now it is, as leaders appear unable to accept that the battlefield and diplomacy are not mutually exclusives, and that one will inevitably impact the other, and that military power equals political advantage. Now, I say here that it seems foreign because, in my opinion, that they know this deep down. And if they didn't, well, these states, they wouldn't focus on offensive weapons and doctrines first and defence second, And also, we know that they understand this because if they didn't, why would they be attempting to put Ukraine in a position of power so the power would equal leverage? Because they knew that battlefield position of power would translate into more leverage and power on the battlefield. Sorry, at the negotiating table. Exactly what we have said about using logic, rationalization and reason one way, but not in the other. And the Russian approach that I see here is textbook realpolitik, not only as a strategy, but as a rejection of the liberal moralism and its focus on hard realities. They're trying to focus more on that sector. And I believe this aligns more with Trump's administration's approach, especially when we see guys like Witkoff and Rubio and the gentleman yesterday who was the head of counterterror, with the exception, I think, of Kellogg, but he seems like a minority in those thinkers there. And the European approach has leaned way more toward this liberal idealism or moral idealism that's placing greater weight on moral values, ethical principles to guide their foreign policy. But we even see some weaker states go a little bit further into what I would see as utopianism, aiming for an ideal rather than accepting maybe the harsh political realities. Now, in an annex to this, it does seem like there is a correlation between countries' ability to have realism and their power, both potential power and their nuclear power and deterrence too. That we see states like the US, France, Germany, China, Russia act very differently on the world stage and have a more of a realpolitik approach. And maybe this is because leaders have inflated ego and a deeper sympathy for the cost of a great state conflict. That's just an annex to that. It's something we can talk about. But where I have real concern for these two approaches, so Russia coming in with this like battlefield reality, realpolitik approach, and then the West coming in with this sort of liberal idealism, moral, ethical, what is right approach, is that this falls apart when you're dealing with an adversary, in this case Russia, who couldn't give two shits about your morals, ethicals, or principles. It falls apart at that. And if anything, Russia has weaponized this actually against the West as well. And this is a propaganda thing that I think has become very successful in the past, say, 6 months, is this idea of it's a battle against modernity. It is a battle against this liberalistic stance. And what this has done is it has stripped these values now of their power, because you're trying to push this, and the more you push it, if there's a rejection, the more it actually strips the power of enforcing that on the adversary as well. And in many ways, what I see at least on Telegram and stuff through in the Russian pages is this embracing of being, quote, the wrong side, and that has then pushed that even further. And I think that, as far as a propaganda aspect, has been very successful. And the too long didn't read of what I'm saying here is, even if you believe the pen is mightier than the sword, don't turn up to the duel with a ballpoint. And if you're dealing with a country that vehemently rejects your morals, your ethics, your standpoint, trying to use those as the way to inflict damage, it's not going to have an effect. Trying to push that onto the T-man in Afghan is going to have no luck, so you talk by the end of a barrel. It's very, very hard politics what is going on here, and as I tried in that disclaimer to say is, I am way more read on the idea of realpolitik, and personally am a large realist here, so maybe my vision is skewed there more away from the impact and power of ethics or morals, but we will see. Legends, you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.